Coming up on the programme for you this morning, you could have more money in your pocket from today. We'll bring you the latest inflation figures very shortly indeed. Warm words, President Putin meets China's Xi. We'll tell you why. And laughing gas to become illegal next month, with dealers facing 14 years in jail. And a kingpin accused of helping to smuggle thousands of people across the English Channel is to be sentenced in Belgium today, where they're live. Turning up the heat on the government, why there's a warning over how heat pumps are paid for. Heading to Israel in just a second. First, Ed's here. Inflation figure.
Inflation figures literally just out this minute. They've stayed unchanged.
Oh, wow.
The consumer price index 6.7%, a teeny bit higher than expected, but kind of unchanged. But I know that you've got a lot on to talk about right now, but I'll come back and talk about it in a moment.
That would be great. What impact will it have on you at home? This is the man who'll be able to tell you in just a second. First, though, let's head to Jerusalem. Standing by for us this morning, it's Mark, of course. Hi, Mark.
Yes, good morning, Kay. And from Jerusalem, we begin with claim and counter-claim over who is to blame for the explosion on a hospital in Gaza that's left hundreds of people dead. That as the US President Joe Biden flies into the war zone this morning. Let's just take you through the morning's key developments. The Gaza Health Ministry says an Israeli airstrike hit the hospital, but the Israeli military says it was a rocket that misfired from the militant group, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Islamic Jihad says Israel is lying. Palestinian health officials in Gaza say at least 500 people have been killed at the hospital. Many people fleeing Israeli airstrikes had been taking shelter at that facility. Now, the US President Joe Biden is on his way right now to the region, despite a summit between himself and the leaders of Jordan, Egypt and the Palestinian Authority being cancelled soon after news of what happened at the hospital emerged. He's now about to arrive in Tel Aviv for talks with Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu. Well, mass protests have been held across the Middle East, in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iran and the West Bank. The former Hamas leader, Khalid Mashal, has called for supporters to immediately stage protests in front of embassies around the world. Well, the latest bloodshed came after more than 600,000 people fled northern Gaza, seeking safety from Israeli airstrikes. Some sought shelter in schools run by the UN. At least 6 people were killed after an airstrike on one such shelter in Al-Maghazi. And then there was this explosion at the Al-Ali hospital in Gaza City. This fireball lit up the Gaza night. It's feared the number of dead could rise, with the Gaza Health Ministry saying it could be as many as 800 people killed. Hundreds of casualties were rushed from the site to Gaza City's main hospital, Al-Shifa, which was already overwhelmed with patients caught up in the fighting over the past 12 days. Well, Gaza's health ministry has blamed the Israelis for the attack, saying it was an act of genocide. Israel has blamed a rocket misfired by the militant group Islamic Jihad.
An analysis of the IDF operational systems indicates that a barrage of rockets was fired by terrorists in Gaza, passing in close proximity to the Al-Hali al-Ma'adi hospital in Gaza at the time it was hit. Intelligence from few sources that we have in our hands indicates that the Islamic Jihad is responsible for the failed rocket launch which hit the hospital in Gaza.
So our Middle East correspondent Alistair Bunkle joins me now from Tel Aviv, and pretty clear from that Israel is insisting it is not them, but it is a hideous loss of life, Alistair, and I suppose could change the course of the war.
It is a hideous loss of life. The images coming out of the hospital are very grim indeed, and the reports that I'm getting about what happened on the ground are unspeakable in many ways. People having to be given surgery in the hospital car park. Many of those who were hit by the strike lost limbs, and an overwhelmed health system in Gaza is already under massive strain and now has to face this. We're in the fog of war. You have claims by the militant groups in Gaza that it was the Israelis, not them. I should say some international organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières last night, who have doctors working in Gaza, also claimed that it was an Israeli airstrike. But the Israelis this morning are adamant that it was not them and that it was a failed rocket launch by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad group. Now, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ for short, is a smaller militant group that operates in the Gaza Strip. Earlier this year, Israel carried out a number of days of airstrikes against their commanders and their infrastructure, taking out a lot of their senior leadership. But whilst this is primarily a war between Israel and Hamas, we can be sure that Palestinian Islamic Jihad are involved as well.
Well, Joe Biden's visit to Jordan was cancelled just hours before he was due to visit the region. It came after the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas withdrew after the hospital was destroyed. Mr. Abbas criticised the US for not taking enforceable action to help his people.
Numerous international decisions have been taken to protect our people, but they have not been implemented because America does not want to enforce them. This aggression against our people must stop, and these crimes must come to an end. We will not allow another catastrophe in the 21st century, and will not accept the displacement of our people once again. Our people will remain steadfast on their homeland, and will not leave, will not leave, and will not leave.
Let's just go back to Alistair in Tel Aviv then. And Alistair, I mean, on the diplomatic front, it is very difficult to exaggerate how this complicates Joe Biden's trip.
It was already tricky. He was already expending potentially an awful lot of political risk by coming here. US presidents tend to travel to places and situations like this when there might be some sort of agreement on the table for them to get over the line and sign. Not this case. There is no hint of an end of this war in the short term. What he would have wanted to try and achieve before taking off was the opening of humanitarian corridors into Gaza, the release of some dual nationals within Gaza, the release of hostages being held in Gaza, and dampening down the tensions around the region to ensure that what is happening in Gaza does not spread elsewhere in the Middle East. Since taking off from Washington last night, his meeting, which would have been a crucial meeting with Mahmoud Abbas, King Abdullah of Jordan, President Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt, has now been cancelled. I think some of them will speak on the phone once he's done his business here in Israel, but that's not quite the same as being face-to-face. And so what he can achieve is somewhat in doubt.
OK, Alistair, for now, thank you very much. Well, what has happened at that hospital in Gaza has sparked protests right across the Middle East. Demonstrators took to the streets in cities in Turkey, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and in the West Bank, not far from here. The former Hamas leader, Khalid Mashal, has called for supporters to immediately stage protests in front of Israeli embassies around the world. Our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, has this report now.
They took to the streets in Iran, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey and the West Bank. This is how the Arab world responded to an explosion at a hospital in Gaza, which killed hundreds of people. Palestinian officials blame Israel. The Israelis say it was a militant Palestinian group. Either way, the devastation has triggered calls for anti-Israel protests in front of embassies across the world. In Ramallah, hundreds of protesters gathered in the city. They threw rocks at police vehicles. The crowd scattered as one surged towards them. Tear gas and stun grenades were used to disperse them, but news too from the Palestinian Health Ministry of a Palestinian protester shot dead by Israeli forces during confrontations in a village near Ramallah. In Tehran, they protested outside the French embassy. They targeted it with eggs as they chanted anti-Israeli slogans. In Jordan, hundreds marched in the capital, Amman. They gathered outside the Israeli embassy, some setting fire to an Israeli flag. They blockaded roads, waving Palestinian flags, until security forces used tear gas. In Beirut, protesters rode motorbikes in the street and voiced their support for Palestinians.
We came out today because of the martyrs. There's only one path, and that's resistance. No negotiations or meeting of leaders or anything. Resistance is the only path for Palestinians. There is no other solution for Palestine than resistance.
The US president is flying here to support Israel, but also to try to stop this crisis spreading. It could well be his hardest challenge yet. Deborah Haynes, Sky News, Southern Israel.
Just a reminder, we'll have a Sky News special programme this evening on the Israel-Hamas war. That'll be live from here in Jerusalem, 9 o'clock, with my colleague Anna Botting. Much more from Jerusalem coming up, but now let's go back to Kay in London.
Mark, thank you. What's happening with those inflation figures? We brought them to you right at the top of the programme. Ed's had a chance to digest them. Tell me more.
Yeah, I mean, these are the numbers for September. They are still very high. I mean, 6.7%, which is the annual rate. That's the rate at which prices are rising each year. It is far higher than the Bank of England's target, which is 2%. And this is the cost of living crisis we're talking about. It's still ongoing for many people. It's still really tough. These numbers are slightly higher than expected, so it stayed the same, basically. But you know that inflation, it did get up to kind of double-digit levels. It's been gradually coming down. And actually, the previous month was a lot lower than expected. This time, it's slightly higher than expected. I don't think, because, you know, one of the things a lot of people are going to look at for this, they're going to look at the numbers, try and work out whether the Bank of England is going to raise rates even higher, because there's lots of things that are squeezing people at the moment. There's prices, obviously, what's going on with your bills, but then there's the Bank of England and its interest rates, which have gone up to 5.25%. The question is whether this makes them think, oh, maybe we need to do a little bit more in the way of interest rates, because normally, all else equal, they raise interest rates and it pulls down inflation. However, this, to me, we'll have to see what happens when markets open, because it's hard to prejudge them. But to me, this looks like something they're not going to panic about, because right now the Bank of England thought that inflation might be at kind of 6.9%. So this is still a bit lower than that. But it's not going down quite as quickly as economists had thought it would.
Two quick questions. How's the government going to spin it? We've got Andrew Griffith on from the Treasury in a moment. And what does it actually mean for people at home?
Well, I haven't seen their spin kind of plan, but I imagine they'll say that it's kind of more or less in line with what they were hoping for, because obviously they want to get inflation halved by the end of the year. Not that there's all that much they can do about it. It's the Bank of England's job, but that's their target they've set themselves. It does look like this is consistent with it going down to that kind of level, because... I'll tell you why. Like, in the next few months, it's likely to drop more. Just because of the previous year, things kind of went up really fast, that we're now kind of onto a new 12 months. And so you kind of knock out that point when things were rising fast. And as a result of that, inflation should kind of go down. Not, like I say, not because things are suddenly getting easier for families, just because it's not quite as bad as it was this time last year. So they're likely to say that's kind of looking kind of OK. But then secondly, you've got question marks about whether benefits and pensions are going to be set on the basis of this. Normally, they take those September numbers and increase benefits in line with them. It'll be a big increase of 6.7%. So are they going to do that? It'll be interesting to see what he thinks about that.
The Chancellor was obviously watching us, because he says, as we have seen across the G7 countries, inflation rarely falls falls in a straight line, but if we stick to our plan, then we will still expect it to keep falling this year. Today's news just shows this is even more important so we can ease the pressure on families and businesses.
I know he watches this show religiously.
Go. You do as well.
I do. If I'm not on, I'm watching.
As indeed do lots of you at home as well. We'll see you shortly. Thanks very much indeed. With that in mind, let me bring you the rest of the headlines so far this morning. The former Prime Minister Boris Johnson's pandemic-era aide, that's Dominic Cummings, has said he will give evidence to the UK COVID-19 inquiry on the 31st of October, Halloween. In a post on social media, Cummings says he was going through his statement with lawyers, a process he described as painful. 2 foreign tourists and their Ugandan guide have been killed in a terror attack in the country's Queen Elizabeth National Park. Police say the victim's safari vehicle was also burned by suspected rebels from the Allied Democratic Forces, an Islamic group responsible for the death of thousands in the past decade. Prosecutors in the US are seeking to recharge actor Alec Baldwin with involuntary manslaughter in connection with the fatal shooting of Helena Hutchins on the set of the film Rust. Charges against him were previously dropped in April, but new analysis suggests the gun's trigger must have been pulled. Britney Spears says she had an abortion while dating Justin Timberlake. The singer's forthcoming memoir details the pair's relationship, which ended in the turn of the century. Spears writes the pregnancy came as a surprise, but agreed to its termination at Timberlake's insistence. A lawyer for the family of Captain Sir Tom Moore has said the foundation set up in his name will be closed down following an investigation by the Charity Commission. The admission was made at an appeal hearing to decide whether a spa at the home of his daughter and her husband should be demolished after being built without planning permission. Let's talk about nitrous oxide, laughing gas. Why is it so important? Good morning.
Good morning too. Well, there's been concerns about nitrous oxide for quite a long time. It's the thirdly most common drug that's used between 16 and 24-year-olds in this country. Now, supplying nitrous oxide for recreational use has been illegal, but possession hasn't been, and that's all going to be changing from next month in just a few weeks' time. And the reason why the government is wanting to clamp down on young people in particular taking nitrous oxide is there's been concern for quite a long time about the health effects on young people. There's the real concern about nerve damage. It's left some young people unable to walk. And I think perhaps it's a drug that's given some young people a false sense of security, perhaps because it hasn't been illegal, that perhaps it's not as dangerous as other drugs. Earlier this year, Sky News did an extensive investigation looking at how easy it was to obtain nitrous oxide illegally, and they also looked at the rise in hospital admissions. But whilst there's the health aspect to it, and clearly that's what the government is concerned about, there's also the visual problem to it as well. I think we've all walked along the street and we've seen those little metal canisters on the floor. And Notting Hill Carnival, apparently, they had 13 tonnes of laughing gas which were gathered up. The question is whether banning it is going to solve the problem. The government's own Drug Advisory Board, they recommended against banning it. The worry is by criminalising it, it could prevent young people coming forward to get help. So that's the worry.
OK, for now, thanks very much indeed. Get more on that throughout the course of the day here on Sky News. Waiting to speak to Andrew Griffith from the Treasury. He'll be joining us just momentarily. Meantime, a man accused of helping to smuggle thousands of people across the English Channel is to be sentenced in Belgium today. Adam's there for us. Hi, Adam, tell us more.
Morning, Kay. This is a man called Hiwa Rahimpour. He sought asylum in Britain. He lived in the East End and then he was arrested last year and accused of being the kingpin of a people smuggling operation that brought thousands, potentially up to 10,000 people involved in an operation to get them from one side of the channel to the other. The National Crime Agency was involved in arresting him along with police authorities in Belgium, in Germany, France and the Netherlands, one of the biggest operations of its kind. Well, he'll be sentenced today if found guilty, along with 20 other defendants. Now, Rahimpour is a complicated man. We've been following this case for over a year, and plenty about him still remains in doubt, about his background, about how important he was. He said to the court, "I am not a boss." Plenty of others think he is the kingpin. Our investigation will be coming up later on, and the court verdict is due in less than an hour.
OK, thank you. Let's bring in Andrew Griffith for the government this morning. Economic Secretary to the Treasury, of course. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us on the programme this morning. Inflation figures, static. What were you expecting?
Well, they're in line with expectations. So, look, when we set this out at the beginning of the year, we all said it was challenging, but it's the most important thing that we can do as a government to try and help ordinary folk, the bills that they're facing each day. It was good that within a flat overall inflation, that food inflation fell by a percentage point. That will obviously speak to people's shopping baskets at the end of each month. So we're on track. It's not going to be easy. We always said it wouldn't be easy. We've had to take responsible but tough choices. But what today's inflation figures show that we agree with most commentators out there that we're on track to halve inflation this year.
The Bank of England will be looking at those figures. Interest rates at the moment 5.25%, could go higher.
Well, they must make their decision. So, you know, the Bank of England is independent. They set their own rates. As I say, this was in line with our expectations, and I believe most forecasters in the market. So my hope would be this doesn't particularly change people's expectations. And the most important thing that we can do is continue to make those responsible and tough choices to achieve the target this year.
How concerned are you that the Bank of England may increase rates still further?
Well, we're doing everything that we can to try and help the economy and to help households. And I understand the impact and the worry that people have about rising interest rates. The best way we can deal with that is not by putting extra borrowing in the economy, making every pound that government spends as productive as possible. And that, I hope, will give the Bank of England, who we support, the space to do their job, but minimise the impact of interest rates on people.
Are you concerned or not?
We're always concerned about the impact on ordinary people, Kay, and that's the big challenge of interest rates. So what's the bit the government can do? What we can do is be responsible with our public finances, not make promises about spending or indeed tax cuts that can't be financed and would put more pressure on inflation and more pressure on interest rates. Of course concerned, but we're doing everything that is within our control to try and minimise that on people.
September is generally the month that you use with inflation for benefits for next year. 6.7%, is that what you're going to work with?
We've just had, I think, 5 minutes ago, the numbers. So you're absolutely right. It's normally the case that following the September release of headline inflation, that my colleagues in government, the Department of Work and Pension Secretary, assesses and makes recommendations about what to do with public benefits. So that process has yet to happen. It wouldn't be right to come out immediately after today's figures. We should let that process run. Last year, as you'll remember, we increased benefits by 10% to protect people, one of the largest ever increases in that.
Yeah, but you did say this is in line with expectations, so that's a figure that you were working with. So
yeah, and there's simply just a process to be followed. It's right that we let that process in the same way as every other year. You know, we take that number, we put that into the process, and in due course update with whatever the government's plans are. But we're always going to be responsible, Kay.
OK, talk to me about what's happening in the Middle East overnight. How are we going to discover who is responsible for that atrocity at the hospital overnight?
Well, first of all, the destruction that we all saw, and I watched on Sky News last night, is devastating, the destruction of that Al Ali hospital. And the protection of civilians, the UK has always been very clear that the protection of civilians is the most important thing. We will work with allies, as you know, the Prime Minister is heavily involved in all of the diplomatic efforts in the Middle East. We'll work with allies to try and ascertain what happened. It's important at this point, everybody's responsible. We don't rush to any judgments, but it's also important that international law is upheld.
Both sides blaming each other.
And you know, that's obviously in the fog of these things, in the immediate aftermath. You know, it's right that, you know, first of all, we regret any loss of human life. You know, the events taking place right now in the Middle East are terrible. What we saw in Gaza, but also before that, what we saw in Israel. Very, very difficult matters. The UK's doing everything it can. It's given more humanitarian aid to Gaza. It's working with the Egyptians. The Prime Minister's spoken to President Sisi about opening humanitarian aid corridors, allowing people to leave if they can.
If it's proven, and we don't know because both sides are blaming each other, if it's proven that it was an IDF rocket that caused the death of hundreds of people sheltering in a hospital, will our Prime Minister still go to Israel tomorrow?
Well, I'm not going to get in, and I hope you'll understand, I'm not going to get into conjecture either about the Prime Minister's movements. He's heavily engaged in the diplomatic efforts. He's spoken to most of the Middle East leaders, as well as remaining in close contact with the US President. I don't think we know that. I don't think we should get into speculation either about that.
What can he achieve by going?
But the UK has a strong record of working with countries around the world, of supporting both the protection of civilians in any conflict theatre, but also in maintaining international law and indeed the international rules-based order.
But I think we can both agree that hitting a hospital is against international law.
Well, we can both agree that this is a devastating loss of human life, and we're seeing that across the region, which is why it's so important that we see so many diplomatic efforts to try and minimise that after the horrifying events that, the terrorist organisation Hamas inflicted on innocent civilians in Israel.
When he goes to Israel, should he also go to Egypt?
I think it's good to talk. It's good to talk, and the UK has a really strong voice. And I know that the Prime Minister is in close contact with many Middle East leaders. He's met the President of Jordan. He's spoken to President Abbas. He's obviously spoken to Prime Minister Netanyahu. That's one really important role for the United Kingdom. Giving humanitarian aid is another, and moving assets to the region, primarily to help with intelligence gathering and humanitarian aid, as the Royal Navy has done, is another really important role for the UK.
How concerned should we be finally about the situation in the UK at the moment? The head of MI5 says he's very concerned.
I think we should all be concerned. It's one reason why we should all be really responsible with our language, not rush to judgment, deeply regret all loss of human life, whether that's in Gaza or whether that's in Israel, and try and support all of the diplomatic efforts to minimise the terrible impact on innocent civilians. And that's what we're talking about on either side.
It's good to see you, Mr. Griffith. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the programme. Thank you. A quick look at what's happening as far as the weather is concerned for you now.
Warm memories wherever you go.
To fly, to fly.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Storm Babette will bring heavy rain and strong winds over the next few days with the risk of flooding and disruption. Weather warnings have been issued with an amber rainfall warning covering parts of eastern Scotland from Thursday. Exceptional rainfall is likely there with 100 millimetres quite widely and up to 200 millimetres on the hills. I'm trying to figure out how much that is. It's quite a lot, isn't it?
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
200 millimetres is 20 centimetres. 20 centimetres is 4 inches, I think. I can only work in, it's about that. Warm words from President Putin for China's Xi Jinping as world leaders meet in Beijing. We'll speak to a representative from the UNFPA Palestine about the explosion at a hospital in Gaza that killed at least 500 people. After Storm Agnes swept across the country last month, the Met Office warns Storm Babette will bring disruptive rain and strong winds.
5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Hello again, everybody. You're watching The Breakfast Show here on Sky News. Inflation has remained the same. We'll have more on that and how it impacts on your weekly budget coming up. And also, you're waking up to the news this morning that an explosion at a hospital in Gaza, northern Gaza, at least 500 people are reported dead as a result of that explosion. Both sides blaming each other. The IDF say it was not them. It was a rocket that has misfired from Gaza, from Hamas. Hamas is saying it was a direct hit by the IDF. We'll get more on that throughout the course of the morning. Will we ever know? Mark standing by for us in Jerusalem. Mark, good morning.
Good morning. It is yet another grim morning here. And earlier I sat down to speak to the veteran Palestinian politician and activist Hanan Ashrawi about Hamas's attack on Israeli civilians, and I pressed her on whether she believed it was justifiable. That was in an interview I did before the strike on this hospital.
They killed 5,000 Palestinians before this 3,000 and some Palestinians killed. That's systematic state terror because they kill long distance, because they don't have to look their victims in the eye. It's an active policy that is being implemented by the Israeli occupation, by the Israeli army on Palestinian civilians.
But surely this was a deliberate act of mass murder.
This was a deliberate act of resisting an occupation army that has been surrounding Gaza, besieging Gaza, regularly bombing and shelling Gaza, killing civilians.
So it's justifiable in your view?
I don't justify the killing of civilians ever, but I justify your misrepresentation because the mainstream media picked up the distortions and the narrative and the versions of Israel, even the lies that were disproven later.
But children were killed and families were killed in the most brutal way.
So this has been happening to Palestinians for decades. Where is your moral outrage? Why is it that you always ask the Palestinians to prove their moral fiber?
Hanan Ashrawi there. Well, I'm joined now by Dominic Allen, who is, he's a representative for the UN Fund for Population Activities in the state of Palestine. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. And I want to talk about what you want to talk about, maternal health in Gaza, in just a moment. But first of all, your reaction to what has happened at this hospital in Gaza.
Well, thanks, Mark. Indeed, I mean, last night and actually since last Saturday, it's simply been horrific. There are no words to describe actually what happened last night. The unfolding humanitarian crisis in Gaza is catastrophic. And for us, we're deeply concerned about the 1 million women and girls in Gaza. And for us as UNFPA, as you said, the 50,000 pregnant women who cannot access maternal health services, they're facing a double nightmare. And in respect to last night and the people who were killed at Al-Ahli Hospital, undoubtedly pregnant women were among those. So we are seeing a healthcare system that is under attack. We're seeing a healthcare system that is crippled and on the brink of collapse. And pregnant women have nowhere to go, and they are facing unthinkable challenges.
Yeah, I mean, the hospitals are already overwhelmed, clearly. Do you have a sense from your people inside Gaza what it is like, not only for mothers and new babies, but for patients, casualties there generally?
Yes, I mean, imagine 2 weeks ago, pregnant woman looking forward to one of the most life-affirming acts that life can bring, bringing life into the world. And right now, the stories and testimonies we hear from the pregnant women we're in touch with, that my team is on the ground trying to work towards helping, are really horrific. We have one pregnant woman who was in the north of Gaza before the displacement order was issued, who says that I couldn't help but think about how my baby was feeling with every explosion. So the pregnant women are suffering. The healthcare workers themselves, as you mentioned, are suffering as well. We've been in touch with midwives in Al-Shifa maternity hospital, one of the many hospitals that have been asked to move, and they're suffering themselves. They're working under significant duress. There are trauma cases coming into the hospital. They're being pushed aside and unable to be treated severe complications that they're facing, and the maternity ward is having to run at a pace which has never been seen before, even if the pregnant women can get to the maternity wards because of the unsafe environment in which they're operating.
Right. What are you trying to do to get stuff in there, like baby formula and so forth, and medicines? What are you trying to do to get it in? And what is your message to the Egyptians, and the Israelis, of course, but the Egyptians who are not opening that border crossing?
Well, the UN is coordinated response for the healthcare system. I mean, our key focus of priorities right now are water, food, medical supplies, and fuel for electricity. And all Gazans have the right access to hospitals and healthcare facilities, as do these pregnant women. Right now, we urgently need to get a humanitarian corridor opened up. The Secretary General himself last night called for a humanitarian ceasefire, that all international humanitarian law should be abided by, so that the medical supplies that are lined up at the border in Egypt and are ready to be moved across can be delivered, so that the medical facilities can get operational, to have this humanitarian ceasefire, so that people can move and people are able to access healthcare facilities, and we can get these medical supplies, water and food across that border and restock.
OK, Dominic, Alan, thank you very much for being with us. We are waiting here in Jerusalem for President Biden to arrive in Israel. He will do so shortly, so we'll have much more from here a little later. But now back to Kay in London.
Thanks, Mark. Murray is here, and of course our own Prime Minister also planning to go there, talk to the Minister about that in about 40 minutes ago.
Yes, and Andrew Griffith wouldn't really give you very much on that visit. Now, we know Sky News understands the plan is for the Prime Minister to go to Israel, could be as soon as Thursday, and that is potentially part of a wider trip to the region. But the questions will emerge around if it's the right timing, if it's the right thing to do, and because there is still a lack of clarity about exactly who is responsible for that attack on the hospital yesterday that we saw so many hundreds of people dying. And I think realistically, the more clarity we get, that will probably help the government make a decision about the timing and if they do go to Israel. But as Biden's landing today, some might say, well, we need to follow suit with our allies and therefore kind of join in with what the US is doing.
German leader, of course, went yesterday on his way to Egypt, got caught up in a potential security incident. I think all ended well. Let's wait and see what happens for now. Thank you. Meantime, President Biden, as we said, visiting the Middle East to work diplomatic efforts in the crisis. Many of the region's leaders have been in China for a summit in Beijing. Helen Ann's there too. Hi, Helen Ann, tell us more.
Good morning, Kay. Ostensibly, what this big summit, this big forum in Beijing is all about is celebrating the 10-year anniversary of a huge flagship policy here in China. It's called the Belt and Road Initiative, essentially a massive infrastructure investment project where China has pumped billions into building roads and bridges and dams and power points in countries all over the world. But what this has done is gathered delegations from across the world, over 140 countries here, 23 heads of state. And I think the symbolism here has been extremely clear. Firstly, China really positioning itself as a global leader. China showing the world that it can bring different nations together, that perhaps even it should be the great power that people look to at times of crisis. The other key symbolism that's really come out this morning is that closeness that China still has with Russia. Vladimir Putin has been here, and there has been absolutely no doubt as to who the guest of honor was. It was Vladimir Putin by President Xi's side when he led the other heads of state into a banquet. Vladimir Putin spoke second this morning after President Xi at the opening ceremony. The closeness of that relationship really coming through in everything that the two leaders are saying. There weren't any direct references in any of the speeches made this morning by heads of state to the situation in the Middle East. Lots of people thought they might have said something, sadly not. But there was some sort of veiled digs at the West. President Xi, for example, saying how if you see other countries' developments as a threat, that will do nothing but hold you back. Clearly a sort of veiled threat, a veiled dig at the US. But look, all eyes are this afternoon as to whether there are any more comments on the Middle East.
OK, thanks. Let's go straight to Israel. The IDF, Israeli Defense Force, holding a news conference. This is a direct result of the situation with a hospital attack in Gaza yesterday. Last night, in the hours of darkness, that death toll increasing all the time. The IDF is blaming Hamas for a misfiring of a rocket which landed on top of the Ali Arab hospital, where people not only were being treated as a result of the continued incursion by Israel following the attack in southern Israel some 11 days ago, but we are hearing from Hamas. They are saying that it was a direct hit from a rocket fired across the border from the Israeli Defense Force. The Israeli Defense Force is saying that they have proof that that was not the case. So I'm guessing that's what he's going to be telling us about in more detail.
We did an immediate review with all relevant branches of the IDF. This is what took place on Tuesday, October 17th. At 6:15 p.m., a barrage of rockets was fired by Hamas to Israel. Then, at 6:59 p.m., a barrage of around 10 rockets was fired by Islamic Jihad from a nearby cemetery. It was at the time that 6:59 p.m. when there were reports of an explosion at the Al-Hali al-Mahadani hospital in Gaza City. According to our intelligence, Hamas checked the reports, understood it was an Islamic Jihad rocket that had misfired, and decided to launch a global media campaign to hide what really happened. They went as far as inflating the numbers of casualties. They understood with absolute certainty that it was a rocket misfired by Islamic Jihad that damaged the hospital. Analysis of our aerial footage confirms that there was no direct hit to the hospital itself. The only location damage is outside the hospital in the parking lot, where we can see signs of burning, which I will show later, no cratering, and no structural damage to nearby buildings, as opposed to the damage caused by any aerial munition, which would have been of different nature. We would have seen craters and structural damage to the buildings, both of which haven't been identified in this incident. The size of the damage we see here is due to the warhead of the Islamic Jihad rocket, but most of the rocket's propellant is still evident due to the short flight of the rocket because the launch failed. The following visual evidence shows infrared imagery of the parking lot. You can see the central locations of fires, some debris of rooftops, no craters can be identified. I want to show you that myself. This is the area of the hospital. Okay? We are showing the parking lot and the hospital. Okay? Those are in red spots. This is not in infrared, so you can understand it betterly. This is the parking lot. This is the parking lot. You can see the parking lot also now in this picture shown here. Okay? Aftermath. After the hit. There is no structural damage to the building. The walls stayed intact. There are no craters here. All of the above, which I said, no structural damage. The walls stay intact, no craters. These are the characterized that shows that are not an aerial munition that have hit the parking lot. We also have examples of what air-to-ground munition creator looks like. As you can see, they do not exist in this instance. Many media outlets immediately reported the unverified claims by Hamas. Those were lies spread by Hamas. I want to make something clear. It is impossible to know what happened as quickly as Hamas claimed they knew. That should have been an initial warning sign for many. Unlike Hamas, the IDF launched an immediate examination, which was overseen at the very highest levels of command. This professional review was based on intelligence, operational systems, and aerial footage, all of which we cross-checked. The evidence, which we are sharing with you all, confirms that the explosion of the Al-Hali al-Mahadani hospital in Gaza was caused by an Islamic Jihad rocket that was misfired. Here are the four main parts of the examination process. First, we confirmed that there was no IDF fire by land, sea, or air that hit the hospital. Second, our radar system tracked rockets fired by terrorists from within Gaza at the time of the explosion. I will show you. The trajectory analysis from the barrage of rockets confirms that the rockets were fired close proximity to the hospital. In addition, there are two independent videos which show the failure of the rocket launch and the continuation of rocket flight towards the ground within the Gaza Strip, falling in the hospital compound. Third, we have intelligence, some that will be shared here, of communication between terrorists talking about rockets misfiring. The terrorists realize that the rocket has misfired and made specific reference to the Al-Hali al-Ma'adani hospital. I would want to let everybody hear the conversation, and I will do the translation in English. I'm telling you, this is the first time that we see missile like this falling, and so that's why we are saying it belongs to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. What? They are saying it belongs to the PGI. It's from us? It looks like it. Who says this? They are saying the shrapnel from the missile is local shrapnel and not like Israeli shrapnel. What are you saying, Abu Amar? But God bless, it couldn't have been found another place, not the hospital, to explode? Never mind, yes, Abu Raji. They shot it from the cemetery behind the hospital. What? They shot it coming from the cemetery behind Al Mahadani hospital, and it misfired and fell on them. There's a cemetery behind it? Yes, Al Mahadani is exactly in the compound. Where is it when you enter the compound? You first enter the compound and don't go towards the city. It's on the right side of Al Ma'adani hospital. Yes, I know it. We have cross-checked intercept with other intelligence sources to confirm this accuracy. It is common for rockets that are fired at Israel to land short and fall inside Gaza. These rockets fall short of Israel and have caused Palestinian casualties. During this war, we have counted approximately 450 rockets that misfired and fell inside Gaza. Palestinian civilians pay the price. I want to show you the footage. These are failed launches during this war until now. These are all failed launches that fell inside the Gaza Strip, and some of them, of course, created casualties among the Palestinians themselves. And one of them was in the hospital Al-Hali El-Mahamadani. We are also sharing this information with our partners. First and foremost, the United States. We want the maximum transparency because we take any incident involving civilians very, very seriously. Unfortunately, many in the media immediately reported the statements coming out from Hamas, controlled in Gaza, which blamed Israel. Instead of waiting for the examination of a credible information from the IDF, some media outlets ran with Hamas lies. Some of those headlines are still up, have not been corrected. I understand the desire to break news, but I hope you will all agree the accuracy and credible information comes before speed. The IDF acts in accordance with the international law. In conclusion, this incident shows how allegations, in this case false and baseless allegations made by terrorists against Israel, can spread and inflame tension in the region. I will now answer questions.
Jeremy Diamond, CNN. Jeremy Diamond, CNN. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you could first explain how an Islamic Jihad rocket could have caused this much death and destruction. And then second of all, I'd also like you to address the question of credibility, because frankly, the IDF has a less than perfect track record with the issue of credibility. Among other incidents, the Israeli government initially claimed that it was armed Palestinian militants who killed the journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, which we know is not true. So why should the world trust you now? Because of the importance of credibility, and in the past we had ourselves were fast to go to conclusions. This is why in this event we took the time. It took us more than 5 hours. We wanted to double-check everything, make sure we're credible. Again, we wanted to double-check everything, make sure we're credible, opposed to the other events that you mentioned. And I will want to answer your first question. I'm saying it again. What I understand the assessment is there were people in the parking lot, probably taking refugees or whatever that came into the parking lot, staying in the parking lot, not inside the hospital itself. This is what we understand. Then, what we understand, because the rocket flight, due to the rocket flight that was very, very short, because the launch has failed, the existence of propellant made a larger explosion than the warhead itself. And this caused the damage of explosion that we see of the burning cars here, okay, because of the existence of a large amount of propellant inside. This is the reason all those cars have been burned, and probably the people were in this parking lot. Just to follow up, one of the difficulties with independently verifying a lot of this information is the fact that journalists are not able to go into Gaza right now.
Okay.
So will you open access for journalists to be able to go into Gaza?
I believe there are journalists now, some journalists now in Gaza, and I can tell you another thing. Hamas has closed the area, is trying to take evidence from the area. The area is now closed. I ask you to send the journalists now in Gaza Strip. Go to the hospital, take evidence.
ABC Ian Panel.
Yeah, good morning, thank you. President Biden says he's outraged, and so are millions of people, not just throughout the Middle East, but elsewhere in the world. Whoever was responsible for this, many will still conclude that if you weren't already bombing Gaza with thousands of strikes, there wouldn't have been so many people in the hospital, and this attack would not have happened. In other words, whatever justification, explanation you can put on it, many people are just going to conclude it's Israel's fault.
I will answer. It's an important question. We have been calling for a couple of days now for the population in Gaza City and its surrounds to go southern from Wadi Gaza because Hamas is using them as human shield. Hamas tries in every way to keep the population by threatening, by taking car keys and other things, blocking the roads. He wants the population in Gaza City because all the infrastructures of Hamas, the terrorist infrastructures down beneath in the tunnels and in buildings among other innocent civilians, and also in sensitive locations like nearby hospitals and in mosques, etc., etc. All of this logic is based that the population will be a human shield. This is why he's so freaked out when people are moving southern to Gaza, to Wadi Gaza. We encourage the population to do so because we put more effort in Gaza City because Hamas control system is mostly in Gaza City. That is the main reason. We carried out our attacks because we were massacred on Saturday. We did not do an initial attack on Gaza. We had a massacre on Israel, an historical massacre which the world haven't seen. It's a Hamas-ISIS massacre in a huge scale. We didn't start. We have to fight. We have to fight. This is the reason we're fighting. We're trying to minimize the casualty of the population. We're encouraging to go southern to Wadi Gaza when we can provide as much a secure area for the population. We keep on encouraging them to do so.
Just a brief follow-up.
Yeah.
You've already encouraged people to move south, and unfortunately it's proved that that hasn't been safe either. The bombing has continued in places like Khan Yunis and towards Rafah, where people have been encouraged to go. And just finally, how does this alter your plans for a ground operation? It has to be a consideration, right?
We are now going to share in these following hours an area of a safe zone for the Gazan that went southern to Wadi Gaza. And we are trying to create the conditions and the corridors. Yes, we do attack in different areas, but when we attack by intelligence. We try to minimize the population in those areas before we attack. That's the logic. And about the next stages of the war, I will not talk about here, of the next stages of the war.
BBC, Jeremy Bowen.
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Do you think that the governments that condemned Israel last night will believe your explanation? I'm referring to Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates.
I think all of the countries that you mentioned are watching the BBC carefully and looking carefully what the BBC said. And I hope after our aftermath that shows it was cross-checked and we took the time because we didn't want to be non-reliable and we didn't want us to infect with our credibility. I hope the BBC will now share this investigation and those countries will listen to the BBC, and we will also share United States a more intimate and also United Kingdom a more intimate review so the BBC can show it. And those countries, those Arab countries that you mentioned, which is very important for Israel, of course, from the Abraham Accords and other countries who also would be threatened by Hamas-ISIS ideology, should understand our war. What Hamas-ISIS did on the massacre on Saturday is nothing to do with Islam. People killed babies, people killed families, women were raped, people were beheaded. This is against Islam. This is against Islam. Any Arab country will show me a fatwa that goes with Islam. This is against Islam. Hamas is ISIS. It's not a one terror activity. It's a scale massacre of the governance of the Gaza city, of Gaza, which is Hamas. Hamas made a scale massacre, which is a govern. It's the sovereign. It's a sovereign massacre. This is why Hamas, ISIS, we must fight it.
If I just follow up on that, I mean, you're essentially saying that these Arab governments watched the BBC and made up their minds. They came out with their statements long before I fired. So, I mean, I'm impressed you think we have so much clout in the world, but to be honest, they have their own sources of information, which is why they moved. Those statements came from the highest level, foreign minister and above.
I guess in the first time, because people feel empathy with hearing that someone bombed an hospital, or when they see people are dying. So they go out and do statements, and it's okay. And I'm not blaming, of course.
They're being emotional, you're saying?
I think, and it sounds reasonable. But now, after evidence being shown, and I think it serves Hamas. Hamas is a terror like ISIS. It's media and sword. He wants to go to the media. He wants to be viral. That creates a viral imagery. So after the conversation you heard when they say it's Islamic Jihad, he said, okay, now we're going to take the benefit out of it and we're going to show the world. And they know it's going to be viral. So I'm not blaming anybody to showing it. I'm just trying to now fix it, because we were blamed before that when we're too speed and to that we're asking, are you credible? We're taking the time to be credible. Sometimes the speed defects it.
Patrick Kingsley, New York Times.
Thanks, Admiral. I had some technical questions. In your footage that you released last night, some of that footage was filmed by Al Jazeera. Our team assessed that footage, and at least one of the munitions appears to be traveling a different direction to the one which you assessed in your map. It's traveling northwesterly, not northeasterly, as your map suggests. Second of all, did the IDF fire any Iron Dome interceptors or artillery munitions at 6:59 p.m. From Israel into Gaza? Thirdly, can you share the intercepted audio of the Hamas members that you just played? That would be important for our assessment.
A lot of questions, Patrick. I don't remember all the questions.
Not got much time. Hospital officials said that smaller strikes targeted the hospital on Saturday, and that they were warned by phone by Israeli officials to vacate the hospital. Do you have any response to that? And finally, is there any evidence of secondary explosions?
Okay, let's start with the first one. First thing, Iron Dome, we do not intercept inside Gaza. Okay? Iron Dome, we do not intercept inside Gaza. This is not an Iron Dome issue. Iron Dome is used for preventing the rockets to being hit in Israel. That's the first question. Second question, those independent videos which we showed of the failure that you mentioned are not only the force element of the check. It's not, we didn't base our facts on those independent videos, it's extra. So I hear what the New York Times says, and it's extra. The reports that you mentioned about telling the hospital to be evacuated earlier days before, I will check it. I do not know the answer. And I want to give you an answer which is incorrect. And you asked about based our facts on those independent videos, it's extra. So I hear what the New York Times says, and it's extra. And the reports that you mentioned about telling the hospital to be evacuated earlier days before, I will check it. I do not know the answer. And I want to give you an answer which is incorrect. And you asked about the secondary explosion in the parking lot. What we see here in the picture, and this is the most important thing. Aerial munition doesn't look like that. Aerial munition of Israel would have caused intact to the walls. It would have caused a crater. Okay, and it makes completely logic, as much as we know, that most of this damage was done due to the propellant existence, not just the warhead, because of the short range, because the launches failed.
To be clear, so the cannon caught fire after landing?
Yeah, because those rockets should have been gone far away to Israel, so you have a large existence of propellant.
Sky News, Deborah Hayes.
Then your enemies are going to still blame Israel, and it's a fact that many Palestinian civilians have been killed since this military operation began. Are you losing the information war? And given how important that is there a potential to maybe change tack? You've said this is going to be, well, officials have said it's going to be a long war. Are you not losing it by using so much military power on Gaza Strip while there are civilians there?
Military operation began. Are you losing the information war? And given how important that is there a potential to maybe change tack? You said this is going to be, well, officials have said it's going to be a long war. Are you not losing it by using so much military power on Gaza Strip while there are civilians there?
Okay, so we'll try to answer the second question before that because I think it's important. The information war is a hard war. It's a hard enemy to win because this enemy has built his logic very, very wisely, using the population as a human shield. Hamas pictured himself in the world as a charity organization, donating money for the poor Gazan of Hamas. While we see all the money that came to Hamas, most of it goes to tunnels, goes to this scale massacred operation, all the donations from many countries in the world, including Europe. Secondly, we've seen, and also UNRWA had verified it, that Hamas is stealing gasoline, food, and also we found in Israel during the massacre the kits of the medical kits were UNRWA kits used by the terrorists. We are fighting something that is hard to explain. He's using the donation that you send, he's using the UNRWA possessions that are meant to go to the poor Gazan, those poor Palestinians that were hijacked by Hamas, and he's using it. He took all the gasoline that could have helped for desalination inside the Gaza for 6 days. It could have gone gas for hospitals. He took it to his own infrastructure, military infrastructure, the terror infrastructures that needs this gas. This is who we're fighting against. This is who we're fighting against. And we have to win this information war with evidence, not with false, uncredible statements. We have to win it with evidence. We have no other way. We must stay moral. We must play according to the international law. We have no other way. Otherwise, we won't be a democrat liberal country. And this is what we're fighting. It's a democrat liberal country fighting any Hamas, ISIS-controlled Gazan area with innocent civilians, Palestinians, that is using them as a human shield. That is the event. That is the event we're fighting. We have to fight. We cannot live next to our borders with Hamas, ISIS governs that will threaten our civilians and do massacre where you rape women, beheaded bodies, kidnap babies. Do you understand that while we speak, babies are being held in Gaza? Women, young girls that went to a music festival are being held in Gaza. Dead bodies are being held in Gaza. Old people, some of them were in the Holocaust, are held now in Gaza. How come you take old people? How come you take babies? How do you kidnap this kind of more than almost 200 people have been kidnapped? How do you do this? Some of them are foreigners. This is what we're fighting. And now they're going to show videos of those hijacks. They want to terrorize the family. We will not be terrorized. We have our values. We know what we're fighting for. We know what we're fighting for. We're fighting for our country. We're fighting to be, with our values, a moral country that is a democrat, liberal, Jewish country. This is who we are. We're going to stay here like that.
Exactly. You suffered this atrocity. You said it yourself, there are Israeli hostages, babies in Gaza, and yet you're still struggling with the information war because Palestinian civilians are being killed in Israeli bombardments. But isn't it time to Is there another way? That's what I'm asking. And can you just answer that question about your assessment on the casualties, please? Can you say it is inflating?
The casualties inflation we understand from intelligence, and we will share it with the governments. And I don't want to say the numbers here. And this is not another round in Gaza. This is not that. It's something else. We understand that the masks have fallen down. We are living next to ISIS governing Hamas state. We cannot live like that. In the world, it's a world problem, not just Israeli problem. It's a world problem. This can shift away, exactly like ISIS. It can shift away to Arab countries, and it can shift away everywhere. I would say cynically that the Gazans should ask Yahya Sinwar, Muhammad Def, Salah El-Aruri, Marwan Issa, why is it happening to them? And if other countries in the world can make Hamas surrender with no conditions and bring our hijacks back to Israel, show us the way you do that. Show us the way you do that. And we will do that. We understand we have no other way to fight that the way we're fighting.
Andrew Fair at the Times. I understand this has already been passed on to the Americans and to other Western allies. Were the Americans involved in the examination debriefing process? And did they at any point provide you with the satellite footage that they have of the area?
No, we used only our systems, Anshul, and we will provide all this information today to the Americans and not just the Americans.
And did you get any no corroboration from any other source outside of the independent video?
We are credible with our information, with our intelligence, with our system. The intelligence is credible all along the intelligence community in the world with the Five Eyes, etc. This would be very, very credible information that any country will rely on. And of course, our footage, imagery, the Air Force way to review things is very, very credible in the world. And those things will show credible to any liberal democracy.
Washington Post, Shira.
Hi, sir. Thank you for this. I have a technical question about the intelligence you got. You said there were people speaking who said the rocket was launched from near Madani to Al-Ahli. So how far were those two locations? That's one. Number two is, what is the rationale of calling the south a safe zone if there are still Hamas operatives there? To what extent is the north the central target right now, and the south, at what point, what is the difference between the north and the south in the campaign? Number two. And number three, you are absolutely right. That money has been funneled from Hamas social organizations to the military ones. But is Israel's goal to take out Hamas completely? Does that mean only military leaders? Does that mean people who are involved in the social services program? How extensive is that? And if that is everyone, does that not just mean that Hamas, is there really a difference between Hamas and Gaza in that sense?
I will start with the last question. I think it's the most important one. There is a completely difference between the Gazan Palestinians and Hamas as a sovereign. It wasn't like that all years. Everybody knows that. It's a completely different thing. And most of the Gazan Palestinians are not Hamas as a sovereign military and politically. But we must take the sovereign, the govern, down. That's for your first question. Then you asked about in the beginning about the intelligence. We understand there is a cemetery nearby, the Al-Hali Al-Mahdani Hospital, and they probably fired from the cemetery, as they mentioned themselves in the conversation. And they also refer to an Islamic Jihad failure, which they are using as a propaganda against Israel. And if you can remind me the other question you asked?
The logic of considering the south as safe zone.
Okay.
Hamas is still there.
Okay. You're right that Hamas is all along Gaza. But most of its military infrastructure and governing infrastructure are in Gaza City and its area. This is why we're asking to go south to Wadi Gaza. Okay? And that is, it's until we finish what we need to finish in this area where it has a governing and military and terrorizing from this area of Gaza City and its peripheral to Israel. But yes, we are will attack in all Gaza by intelligence, and we will attack by international law. And before that, it will be based on intelligence, and which we will try always to minimize the casualties of civilians.
AFP Patrick.
Yes, Patrick Caniglia with Agence France Presse. This very serious incident just occurred in the hospital. Do you think it will delay or prevent you to launch a ground operation inside Gaza if it's actually what you're planning to?
This is a very serious incident because civilians were casualties. This is why we take it seriously. This is why we took our time to be credible. Again, this is why we took our time to be credible and we didn't jump into statements. So we take it very, very seriously. And I think the world should hold up Islamic Jihad. And everybody knows who's funding Islamic Jihad. Islamic Jihad is 100% funded by Iran. The rockets of Islamic Jihad are funded by Iran. I repeat it. Iran funds Hamas, but it does 100% for Islamic Jihad. Islamic Jihad caused the casualties in the hospital, in Al-Halil Ma'adani hospital. The casualties are by Islamic Jihad. The rocket is being funded or delivered from Iran. Iran caused these deaths in Al-Halil Ma'adani hospital in the end of the day.
Just a follow-up question.
The stages of the war, I will not talk about them here.
Just a follow-up question. How are you planning to differentiate the population with the Hamas guys inside Gaza, knowing, as you are saying, that they are using the population as human shield? Isn't it an impossible task?
I think for us, during our 75 years here in this region, before we came here, we were in other places. And some of the Israelis were here for a long, long years ago. But we are used to impossible missions, and we understand it's a complex mission because Hamas has hijacked, not just our hijacked Israelis, babies, women, old women, and others. He hijacked the Gazan population. He hijacked them. They could have been prosper. You know that Israel brings in Gazan workers by thousands. They bring in Gazan workers to make economy in Gaza better. We bring them in to make it more prosperous. That money goes, some of it goes to Hamas, and then Hamas executed. He doesn't want Gaza prosperous. He doesn't care about economy. He cares about jihad. And I don't know if it's even jihad. Anybody in Islam can explain this event. The Islamic world, the Islam can explain what we're seeing here. Kidnapping babies, raping women, beheading people by a government-scale country operation. Massacre.
Jerusalem Post, Yonako.
Is there a risk from the classified intelligence that you just exposed of sources and methods? You played a signals intelligence conversation with Islamic Jihad for the general public shortly after it happened. They can see the transcript. They can see which phones you were tapping. Is there a debate about whether or not to expose the signals intelligence to the public?
We have to be credible here. We take our own risks. This is what I have to say.
I-24, Robert.
Good morning. You discussed the fact that you have shared intelligence with the US and with the UK. What other countries have you shared intelligence with?
I want to be accurate. We are going to share more intelligence that I've shared here with our friends. First of all, United States, then other countries in Europe. We're going to share it. Okay, this is what I said. I want to be accurate.
And can you tell me which other countries you intend to do this with? And will there be any of your neighbors in the Middle East that you intend to share that intelligence with?
It will be the decision of the government, and I'm sure we're going to make the right decision in order to make everybody clear who is to blame.
Michael Hauser-Tov, Haaretz.
One question for the Israeli audience, please. דובר צה"ל, ברשותך. כבר היינו פחות או יותר בסרט הזה במהלך השנה שעברה, אוגוסט 2022, כאשר רקטה פגעה בבית בג'באליה, הרגה 4 ילדים. גם אז לקח לצה"ל כמה שעות להוציא את התגובה, שזה בעצם שיגור של הג'יהאד. נראה שלא למדנו שום לקח, וזה חזר לכם גם עכשיו. איך אתה מסביר את כמה שעות עד שלקח לכם להוציא איזושהי תגובה ראשונית לכל האירוע הזה?
We have to be, the question was how did we not learn? We had an event like that a couple of years ago in Jabalia. and it took us a couple of hours, and then the world and the media, it caused the damage to Israel. We have to be credible. You mentioned Shireen Abu Akleh, you mentioned other, we have to be credible. This is our lesson learned. We have to be credible with the world, we have to be credible with the media. We are a country, a liberal democracy. It means that the freedom of press and being credible to the press is an essence to Israel. It will take us time, and it did take us time yesterday, because it's not Jabalia, it's a hospital, it's in a larger scale. We had to be accurate and double-check, and double-check, and double-check, and now come and show you the evidence.
Henry Meyer, Bloomberg.
Yes, hello, Admiral. I have a question regarding the potential ground offensive. I understood from your answer that that is still planned. Has the U.S. advised in any way to try and delay this operation?
I'm here to talk about the event of the hospital Al Ali Al Mahadani, but the war, the target of the war, is to take out Hamas, ISIS, governance, sovereignty, terror sovereignty, out. We will use all the measures we need at the time comes, in the right time, to do them.
Neri Zilber. Last question.
Neri Zilber, Financial Times. Last night in the videos that you provided, the before and after of the parking lot in the hospital, and also in the post-explosion image here, we don't see any people, we don't see any bodies. How do you explain that?
Because we are trying to be careful, because we haven't seen also the evacuation of the body, and I don't know the number of the casualties, and maybe they're inflating according to our intelligence, so we have to be accurate. But you can see, and I guess it might be true, that people were thinking that the parking lot is a safe zone. But unfortunately, Islamic Jihad failed rocket failed in this parking lot, and this might have caused this event of casualties, as you mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And thank you very much.
So you can see the pictures to the right of your screen. We are expecting Air Force One to arrive in Tel Aviv very shortly. I'm not sure that is Air Force One. In fact, it isn't. But we are expecting him to arrive very shortly. That was a news conference from the Israeli Defense Force explaining in some detail, Mark, why they say they were not responsible for the bloody assaults on a hospital last night in Gaza.
No, that was Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari we were listening to, and it was a very clear explanation from him of why the IDF think that it was not them. They say they had evidence that it was Islamic Jihad that caused this. In fact, it was a lack of evidence that it was Israel in many ways. He was pointing out that the car park that was hit displayed no craters that would have been caused rather by an Israeli missile. He said it was not an aerial munition that hit that parking lot. He also said the structure of the building remains largely intact. He said the explosion was caused by an Islamic Jihad rocket that misfired, landed in the car park, and then ignited vehicles in the car park. And when people asked, how could a rocket have caused that much destruction? He said it was the ignition of the explosion caused by the vehicles in the car park that did that. He said he was clear nothing was fired from land, sea or air by Israel. He provided what he called trajectory analysis that showed rockets were fired close to the hospital. He played an Islamic Jihad recording that they had intercepted. And he then made the point repeatedly, under questioning, that the IDF act within international law, and pointed out that the Israelis thought the media should be more cautious in accepting, as he put it, Hamas claims. He said the war would continue. Hamas was ISIS. It is a massacre, and we must fight it, he said. That is their evidence. Alistair Bunkle is in Tel Aviv awaiting the arrival of President Biden. And Alistair, that is their evidence. People will make up their minds, but they are insistent it was not them.
People will make up their minds. People will have already made up their minds, particularly in the Arab world. And I think whatever the Israelis have to say, and however much detailed intelligence they release to prove their position, frankly, there will be a lot in the Arab world who just simply do not believe it. And as we've been saying over the last few hours, that is why what happened last night, regardless of who was to blame for it, puts this situation into an even more dangerous moment than almost of any of the last 12 days. And we saw the protests on the streets of the West Bank, of Beirut and of Amman last night. We know for a fact that rockets launched by Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad do misfire and they do land short. That happens. And that is what they're claiming happened in this instance. We have to take the IDF's word for it, that when they say that no missiles were launched by them from land, sea or air, they've been able to establish that in the hours since by speaking to their various units that might or might not have been involved. I think some people listening to that press conference might still have some questions, not least as you were touching on there, Mark, about the size of the explosion. People have pointed out that when Hamas or Islamic Jihad rockets hit parts of southern Israel, whilst they can do some damage, whilst they can cause loss of life and injury, they never really make the sort of damage that we saw at the hospital last night. But Daniel Hagari explained that as being an effect of some of the cars igniting in the parking lot, and so that is the IDF position on it. I would say as a communications observation, given how important the media war is in any war, the fact that he has come out, spoken on live television and at that length is a briefing of the like we have not seen before over the last 12 days. He was happy to take questions, it seemed, from anybody who had them. Normally the IDF briefings are limited to around about half an hour, not so this time. The Israelis will know that it is very, very important that they get their message out there, and their message is rooted in intelligence and in facts, not just through the international media, but for particularly the Americans and the American president who is about to land. They will share more intelligence with him than they shared with us in that presentation. It might also be, and I'm speculating here, that the Americans might have some intelligence of their own. They have very good satellite coverage of the Middle East, and it wouldn't be a surprise if they've directed some of those over the Gaza area on a permanent basis, given what's going on at the moment. And on those strike carrier groups they sent to the Eastern Mediterranean, they have some very advanced surveillance planes as well. So it might be that the Americans can bring something to the table to assure them that this was not Israel who was at fault. But as I would reiterate, as we've already seen, what the Israelis say is one thing. The reality on the ground, I'm afraid, is very different.
Yeah, Alistair, I think, look, the timing of when they did this news conference is very interesting, because you're in Tel Aviv, you're waiting for Joe Biden to arrive, and they will have been very keen to put all this out there, lay this out there before Joe Biden arrives.
They will need to convince a US president who might now have increased skepticism about the wisdom of this bombing campaign. They need to convince him that they are doing everything possible to limit civilian casualties, and they're acting in accordance with international law. And being upfront and being public about what they know about certain incidences, like the one last night, is a part of the Israeli credibility as they seek to maintain the solidarity and support, both political and militarily, that they've enjoyed so far from the West.
Right, and when Joe Biden does arrive, and he's due any minute now, we're keeping our eye on every aircraft that comes in at the moment, but when he does arrive, it is quite a gamble for him politically, given this turn of events.
Yeah, and Joe Biden is a president who has a long history in foreign policy. When it comes to the presidential elections next year, assuming it is Donald Trump who he is up against, he will feel that foreign policy is an area of strength for him, even if foreign policy doesn't always play a great role in US presidential elections. But what happens during this visit and subsequent to it will be a major part of that. He comes here with huge political risk attached to this visit, make no bones about it. It was already going to be tricky. He has a number of areas that he needs to make progress on. The release of hostages, the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza, the access or the exiting of dual nationals from Gaza into Egypt, and making sure that he speaks to regional leaders and makes sure that the temperature around the Middle East is lowered. But subsequent to what happened last night, all four of those tasks become that much harder.
OK, Alistair, we're going to take a break now, which will virtually guarantee that Joe Biden arrives. But we're going to take the break anyway. We'll be right back from Jerusalem and from Tel Aviv right after the break.
Five of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Welcome back. We're just keeping an eye on events at Tel Aviv Ben Gurion Airport, where President Joe Biden is due to arrive at any moment, and he does so in the middle of a very dangerous moment in this conflict with the Israelis, coming out this morning and vehemently denying that they were involved in the explosion that caused so many lives to be lost at the hospital in Gaza. Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, we've just been listening to him at a news conference. He was saying that, pointing out that the car park that was hit displayed no craters whatsoever, that he says would have been caused by an Israeli missile. He said it was not an aerial munition that hit the parking lot. He said the explosion was caused by an Islamic Jihad rocket that misfired, landed in the car park, and ignited the vehicles in that car park, causing an explosion that then caused the loss of life. He was told reporters nothing at all was fired at that time from land, sea, or air by Israel. And into this difficult moment will fly President Biden any moment now. He's due to come in to see Benjamin Netanyahu. Alistair Bunkle is in Tel Aviv waiting for the president. But it has to be said, Alistair, it is not the trip that the president was planning.
No, it's not. The news about the incident, the tragic incident at the hospital in Gaza City, was breaking just as he was preparing to depart the White House, to such an extent that we did wonder whether or not he might cancel the trip. He's decided to plough on ahead with it, even though it is a truncated visit. He will spend a number of hours on the ground here in Tel Aviv, maybe slightly longer now, because he is not going to the Jordanian capital, Amman, where he was due to meet with the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, the Jordanian King Abdullah, who was hosting the meeting, and the Egyptian leader Fattah al-Sisi. That meeting has now been cancelled by the Jordanians as a result of what happened at the hospital. I think Joe Biden will still speak to Abdullah and Abbas on the phone once he has wrapped up his business here, but that's no substitute for a face-to-face meeting. And a face-to-face meeting with those four key Arab leaders would have been very important for the US president to get his position across, to hear their views as well, and to see whether or not he can make some progress in various areas. Let's not forget, he's had his senior diplomat, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, on the ground in the Middle East for coming up for not far off a week now. Blinken came here first last Friday. He then did a tour of the Middle East to Jordan, to Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt before returning here. And then when it was decided that President Biden would visit, he went, this is Antony Blinken, to Jordan, where he's been ever since. So the diplomatic wheels, particularly from the Americans' perspective, have been turning incredibly fast. Antony Blinken has been working overtime to try and find progress on a number of routes. And I think the hope was probably, I'm reading into why Biden was coming, is that the presence of the US president would be able to maybe get some things over the line that were still in negotiation.
Yeah, and I don't know whether you heard the whole of the news conference with Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari of the IDF that was held this morning. It was an unusual news conference by the IDF in my experience, that it was longer than normal and it was more detailed than normal.
So we have IDF briefings most days, not every day, but most days. They're over Zoom, sometimes very early in the morning, sometimes a bit later on in the day. They normally last half an hour, 40 minutes. Questions are limited. Not everybody who's on those calls gets a chance to pose a question. This time it was different. It was being held in the Kyria, which is the Israeli Ministry of Defense, and it went on for a long time, and anybody who wanted to ask a question was allowed to do so.
OK, Alistair, stay with us. We're going to go back to London and Kay now, but we'll keep our eyes on Ben Gurion Airport, and we'll be back with you in a little while. Kay, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. As we continue to look at those images, as you said, waiting for President Biden to arrive, whistle-stop tour to the region. Richard Makepeace, former Consul General to Jerusalem, is with us now. Hello to you. Thank you for joining us. How important do you think this visit is today?
Well, I think it will be extremely important, but what I do hope is that it will help resolve some of the humanitarian issues. I'm really here today because I'm a trustee of medical aid for Palestinians, and it is a desperate situation for the health sector. I remember saying on an earlier broadcast that I really hoped the health sector would not be targeted, and of course now that's exactly what's happened.
We don't know who targeted, though. IDF are going to extreme lengths to try to prove, in their opinion, that it isn't them. I'm sure the wider region, whatever the IDF says, will not believe them. But talk to me about the situation from your experience and your expertise in Gaza at the moment. The IDF also saying, as part of their news conference, that they have implored people who are in the north of the region to move south.
Well, it's all very well to implore people to leave, but I think many Gazans in the north will feel that it's not safe to move south, particularly when convoys of refugees moving to the south have been attacked, in attacks which I don't think the IDF have denied. There are no proper reception arrangements for them in the south. There are shortages of food and medicine and even water. And I think also you have to remember that many of those in the north are refugees themselves. They're the descendants of those who were told to move from their homes 75 years ago and expected to be able to come back. So it would be only human for them to wonder, if they do leave, will they be allowed back? And will their homes exist when they come back? When and if they come back?
I was reading some alarming statistics this morning, an extra 1 million mouths to feed in the south at the moment, and a child dies every 15 minutes at the moment in Gaza. It's an absolute catastrophe, a humanitarian crisis. What can the West try to do to help? Aid is not going in.
Well, I think the essentials are to get basic services going. Medicines need to get in, fresh water needs to get in. I mean, you have to remember that the situation in Gaza has been very difficult for years now. There have been shortages of food and medicine and fresh water, proper drinking water, on a regular basis for years, and very little power.
Is it reasonable to blame Israel for that?
It is reasonable to say that Israel plays a part in that.
So
certainly.
does Hamas, some might say?
Well, I think one can pass blame around as one wishes. I think from our perspective as a charity, the fact that's unacceptable is that it hits, as you say, so many children and also so many non-combatants, and the vast majority of the casualties and indeed of the fatalities are clearly of non-combatants.
What's life like in Gaza, even before the raids that we have seen over the last 10, 12 days?
Well, life is pretty miserable, especially if you're a young person, and it is a very young society.
60% of the population are children.
Exactly. Of young people of employable age, there is unemployment running in around 70% or more. These young people have really no prospect. They can't get out to go and work somewhere else. They don't necessarily want to get out. They feel a responsibility, obviously, for their families. But what can they do to help? A huge number of the population are actually dependent on food aid from the UN Relief and Works Agency.
And how is that getting in at the moment, given that the Rafah crossing, which is the crossing between Gaza, for the benefit of our viewers, Gaza and Egypt at the moment, is closed?
Well, the short answer is it's not.
What are you doing about it?
Well, we've been pushing the British government and, along with other aid agencies, lobbying other governments and the United Nations, who obviously are in the lead on this, to get that crossing open so that relief supplies can get in.
Do you understand why Egypt doesn't want to do that at the moment?
Well, I think there needs to be an agreement involving not just Egypt. I mean, we can't start sending convoys of trucks into Gaza and then have them bombed, or indeed, just have medical supplies being destroyed. There would need to be an agreement, a proper agreement with timings and routes and so on. And that would have to include getting medicines to Al-Shifa Hospital, for example, which is also, as I understand it, almost running out of diesel for their generators. And of course, at that point, people die. babies in incubators die, people in intensive care die, and a lot of medical procedures are simply rendered impossible.
I've spoken to several politicians here in the UK over the last few days asking whether what's happening in Gaza is a humanitarian crisis, and particularly government ministers have stepped back from saying it is as yet.
Well, I think from the perspective of the medical sector, it definitely is a crisis. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation that it may well soon be impossible even to deal with basic hospital requirements. And of course, these aren't basic hospital requirements. I mean, the munitions being used cause huge injuries, trauma injuries, burns, and so on. And these people, many of them children, most of them civilians, deserve to get the best treatment available.
And what can British people watching this morning, what can they do to try to help?
Well, we've obviously launched an appeal, medical aid for Palestinians, but there are other aid agencies as well. And I would say it's very important to raise awareness and to make the point to our politicians and others that this is not just more of the same. This is, as you say, an absolute tragedy, and we're watching it unfold.
OK. Thank you for taking the time to join us. We really do appreciate it. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Continuing coverage on Sky as we wait for Joe Biden to arrive in Israel shortly.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news.
OK, this looks like Air Force One arriving now here in Tel Aviv. Mark on the ground for us, of course, as is Alistair. Mark, hi.
Yes, hi, Kay. And finally, we see the President's plane coming into Tel Aviv, into Israel, and I have to say into a very difficult situation caused by this explosion at the hospital in Gaza last night, in which the Gazan health authorities are saying at least 500 people have been killed. And that puts the emphasis on civilian casualties in Gaza when this was the president coming into Israel to stand behind Israel, to condemn the Hamas massacre and support the families of those with people missing, of those whose relatives have died, and of course those whose relatives are being held hostage in Gaza. Overnight, questions about how this strike on the hospital had happened. And then this morning, before this plane came into view, there was this news conference in which the IDF are making it pretty clear that they think they did not do it. And they produced what they say is evidence that there was no crater in the car park of the hospital, and they say that would certainly have been caused by an Israeli missile, and they produced other evidence, and they did it all before what is happening now, what you're witnessing now, which is the US president arriving in Israel. Alistair Bunkle is also in Tel Aviv, and I mean, it's true to say, Alistair, that, you know, whatever happened in Gaza, a trip that, you know, was to show complete support for Israel has been complicated and nuanced to the extent that the focus is on civilian casualties in Gaza?
And I think that will worry the Israelis. I think that is why we've seen a pretty rapid response from the Israeli Defense Forces to gather together some evidence to back up their claim that they were not involved. And they say they're going to share more intelligence with the Americans today. And as I was saying to you a little bit earlier, it'll be interesting to see whether the Americans have any of their own intelligence, given some of the military assets that they have around the region at the moment. Maybe we won't find out about that, but it might be something that they could add to the mix. But the Israelis will be very aware that what happened in Gaza last night was broadcast on news channels across the world, in particular America, ahead of the US president's visit over here, a visit that was always going to be very hard, very much loaded with a lot of political risk attached to it, but a visit that the US president, for whatever reason, was minded to make. I mean, of course, he will be here to show solidarity to Israel and the Israeli people. The Americans have been absolutely steadfast in that ever since those awful attacks 12 days ago. But I just wonder whether or not the events, the bombing campaign of the last 12 days, but particularly what happened last night, you know, regardless who was to blame, what I don't think anybody is questioning is that a lot of civilians were caught up in that. And, you know, that is a consequence of war, but it will be something that President Biden will be very keen to impress upon the Israelis that from their side, at least, much more is done, or much is done, sorry, I should say, to make sure that civilian casualties are kept very low, not just for humanitarian reasons, but also for the wider region, because the more that Palestinians in the West Bank, the more that Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Iranians see civilian casualties in Gaza, the closer we get to the point where they might feel that they have no other choice but to enter this conflict in a way that they haven't done thus far.
And we'll obviously see Joe Biden in just a moment, but before we do, it's worth just going over, Alistair, what the Israel Defense Force said. They said there was no crater in the car park of this hospital. It was not an aerial munition that hit the parking lot. He also said the structure of the building, the hospital building, remained largely intact. And they were clear they thought the explosion was caused by an Islamic Jihad rocket that misfired, landed in the car park, ignited vehicles in that car park, and then exploded. And that was when he was asked about whether that would have caused the number of casualties that Hamas are claiming. He said, well, it then ignited these vehicles, they exploded, and people were staying, seeking sanctuary in that car park. But he was clear nothing was fired from land, sea or air by Israel. I just wonder what you made of what they had to say.
Well, just on that note about Admiral Hagari, forgive me, saying that nothing was fired from land, sea or air. I mean, that should be something that the Israelis can establish very quickly and without any doubt. They will have, as any military does, awareness of what any of their military assets are doing at any one time. That is not necessary to mean that they know every time a missile is launched, but they will, or they should be able to find out pretty quickly whether or not any of their assets were engaging targets in Gaza at that moment. They say that there was a barrage of rockets out of Gaza from Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas at that moment. It was asked in the press conference whether or not the Iron Dome was triggered to release any interceptors to deal with that barrage. Daniel Hagari's answer was that we don't intercept missiles within or over the Gaza territory itself, which I have to say I didn't think was a complete answer, because if Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad fired a salvo of rockets, of which one or maybe two malfunctioned and fell short, then what happened to the others? And I think the point of the question, which was from the New York Times, was, you know, did you engage your missile defense systems at the same time? So are you therefore able to match up what you were doing with the timings of this? They were very detailed, though. It was a lengthy press conference, much longer than we are used to. I think they took questions from everybody who wanted to ask them. They certainly took a lot of questions, much more than you would get in your normal IDF daily briefing. It was live. It was not on Zoom, as is the common way of doing it with the IDF on a day-to-day basis. And I think all of these things point towards the Israeli effort to clear up what happened, to get their side, their version of events across to the wider world, and to do so before Air Force One touched down.
Do you think it will change the nature of the Israeli operation? Certainly Admiral Hagari suggested not. I mean, do you think it will change the nature of the operation? Will, for that matter, Joe Biden's visit change the nature of what the Israelis were planning militarily?
I don't think from the Israeli perspective what happened last night will change the direction of their operation. I do think it is possible that Joe Biden, even if he is convinced by the Israeli explanation for what went on, I do think it is possible that he will urge a caution going forward in a way that he might not have done in the previous 11, 12 days. Joe Biden has known Benjamin Netanyahu for many, many years. Netanyahu often reminds us about it. They met, I think, when Biden was a young senator and Netanyahu was a young diplomat at the Israeli embassy in Washington. So their relationship goes back decades. But their relationship in the last, well, this year, leading up to the attacks of 12 days ago, was not good. They clashed over the proposed judicial reforms here. Joe Biden was very outspoken about his skepticism about whether these judicial reforms were the right thing to pursue. He had not invited, very pointedly, Benjamin Netanyahu to visit him in the White House, and most Israeli leaders are given that coveted invitation fairly early on in their time in office. I think the time that Benjamin Netanyahu had to wait before he met Joe Biden was the longest since any Israeli prime minister, dating back to the late 1950s. So that's the sort of relationship backdrop to what's happened. But clearly what has happened since the 7th of October has changed things. And Joe Biden has expressed on a number of occasions in public his unwavering solidarity for Israel, his sorrow and outrage at what happened. And I can't for a moment see him wavering from that, and why would he? But he has proven this year that he is not afraid about speaking out or expressing his mind against the Israeli Prime Minister if there is a difference of opinion. And so I think if Joe Biden has reached a position where he feels that this war is at a very dangerous point of inflection, then it might be that he has a slightly sterner position to take with Benjamin Netanyahu than he did a week ago.
Yeah, Alistair, we're just looking at the door of Air Force One, which has touched down at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. Just caught a shot there of Benjamin Netanyahu, who is here to meet the president for what could be a very important visit for both men. One wonders whether after the events at the hospital he considered not coming, but he is here. He is stepping down the steps onto the soil of a country at war, and will head straight to meet Benjamin Netanyahu. And those two have a lot to talk about. And Alistair, it's interesting, isn't it? He's he's come anyway. He's going to have these talks with Benjamin Netanyahu, but the trip was about a broader diplomacy, talks with King Abdullah of Jordan, Palestinian Authority, the Egyptians, I think he was going to talk to. It's not clear now, is it, that he will speak to them, or will he speak to them on the phone?
It's my understanding that I think he will try and have a conversation on the phone with Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, and King Abdullah, the Jordanian leader, who was due to host that meeting in Amman later today, but subsequently cancelled it after last night's events. So I think he'll have a phone conversation with them once he's finished here in Tel Aviv, perhaps when he's back aboard Air Force One and en route home. But that is no substitute for meeting in person. And so the cancellation of that meeting, I think literally as he was taking off last night, or if not, minutes after he did take off, well, that will, I'm sure, be a disappointment to Joe Biden, Antony Blinken, who is currently, or was, sorry, overnighting in Amman, and they would have wanted that meeting to happen. I mean, another just a quick side note on the diplomacy, but the American position here, they're without an ambassador here at the moment. The previous ambassador, Thomas Nides, left a few weeks ago. The proposed new US ambassador, Jack Lew, a very big figure in US politics in years past, has not yet been approved by Congress, but Stephanie Hallett, the US charge d'affaires here, who's effectively taken over as US ambassador in Israel for the time being, whilst there is that gap, is considered a very, very safe pair of hands. But I say it's a side note, but these are important figures when the Israelis and the Americans are working the diplomatic channels over time. They are the ones who will be trying to plug into the Israelis, trying to plug into the Palestinian leadership and others around the region. And so what we have seen working in parallel alongside Israel's military campaign in Gaza is America's diplomatic campaign in the Middle East. From Israel to Jordan to Qatar to Bahrain to Saudi Arabia to the UAE to Egypt, almost everybody has been brought into that diplomatic conversation with the Americans, with the exception of course, Iran, although what the Americans will have done is they will have used channels like the Qataris to be able to convey messages and receive messages from players like the Iranians.
Yeah, I'm not sure how long he's going to be here now, given all that's changed. But there is another important element, Alistair, of the visit, and that is to show support for these relatives, these families who have people missing, who have people who have died, and of course who have people being held hostage in Gaza. And I think President Biden will consider that a very important part of this trip.
Yeah, I think he will do, and it is an important part because this was an attack on Israel, but not just on Israelis. There were multiple nationalities caught up in what happened 12 days ago in those horrific terror attacks in southern Israel, including many Americans. There are many Americans that we believe are still being held hostage inside Gaza. So their families, the families of victims, and the families of those who are still missing, presumed kidnapped, will be an important element of Joe Biden's visit here. And that is going to be happening later on, once he's had those initial meetings with the Israeli War Cabinet. It will be front and center for him to try and find a way forward with the negotiations to get some of the hostages released. All of this time, since those events, the Israelis, with the help of the Americans and others, have been trying to gather intelligence as to where the hostages are being held. But I think the reality is that they'll be spread around the Gaza Strip. Many of them will be being held underground. And Hamas have said, if we are going to take their word for it, and that should always come with a warning, but Hamas have said that some hostages have been taken not by them, but by other groups, and that they don't even know themselves exactly how many are held. And so that gives you a sense, I hope, of how complex the hostage situation is. Just a reminder, 199 hostages is the Israeli estimate. It could be even more. So it's a big, big number. It's very, very complicated. And if they can avoid it, they will not want to be launching hostage rescue missions that are always fraught with huge amounts of risk, regardless of what theatre they're operating in, but particularly somewhere like Gaza. So the ideal scenario would be that some sort of agreement is reached with Hamas to release hostages. That might, in the first instance, be women, children and the elderly. I cannot see Hamas agreeing to release any Israeli soldiers that they've captured. I think they will demand a huge price for that. But it might be that they could be convinced to release women, children and the elderly as a sign of compassion. But that will be a negotiation process that will be done via third parties, like the Qataris, for example, who do have that direct link into Hamas, who host the Hamas political leadership in Doha.
Yeah, we're just watching Joe Biden leave the airport and Prime Minister Netanyahu leaving the airport, and they, I'm sure, will be heading straight off for talks about what is going on, what will happen in the coming days and coming weeks, and I'm sure that he will be briefed by Israel's military leaders, and then after that I think he will... I mean, he is a president, Alistair, who is known, I suppose, for that sort of strength of personal empathy, so it may well be that he can bring some sort of comfort to these families.
Well, as we know, he's a president who has sadly experienced the loss of his own children and his own close relatives. So he's a president who has demonstrated huge empathy in the past, in his years in the White House and when he was the vice president to Barack Obama, in particular for victims of gun violence in the United States, but the victims of terror attacks. I expect that's the president that we will see later on today when he meets the relatives of some of the victims of October the 7th attacks, and of course some of the family members of those who are still being held hostage. He is a president who displays genuine empathy, but that is a genuine empathy born out of tragic personal circumstances on his own part.
OK, Alistair, for now, thanks very much indeed. Let's just remind viewers of the explosion that took place at the hospital in Gaza. The fireball lit up the Gaza night. It's feared the number of dead could rise. The Gaza Health Ministry claims it was an Israeli airstrike that hit the hospital, but the Israeli military have been saying all morning that it was a rocket that was misfired from the militant group, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Islamic Jihad basically says that Israel is lying, but it was a pretty strong explanation by the Israelis this morning, and we await more evidence that the Israelis say they're going to bring forward. But the reality is that hundreds of casualties were rushed from the site of that explosion to Gaza City's main hospital, Al-Shifa, which was already overwhelmed with patients caught up in the fighting over the past 12 days.
There are no safe houses here, no safe hospitals, not even the schools or ambulances. There's no safety, nothing like that.
Well, as I was saying, we heard from the IDF this morning. Here's what they had to say about that explosion at the hospital.
According to our intelligence, Hamas checked the reports, understood it was an Islamic Jihad rocket that had misfired, and decided to launch a global media campaign to hide what really happened. They went as far as inflating the numbers of casualties. They understood with absolute certainty that it was a rocket misfired by Islamic Jihad that damaged the hospital. Analysis of our aerial footage confirms that there was no direct hit to the hospital itself. The only location damage is outside the hospital in the parking lot, where we can see signs of burning, which I will show later, no cratering, and no structural damage to nearby buildings, as opposed to the damage caused by any aerial munition, which would have been of different nature. We would have seen craters and structural damage to the buildings, both of which haven't been identified in this incident. The size of the damage we see here is due to the warhead of the Islamic Jihad rocket, but most of the rocket's propellant is still evident due to the short flight of the rocket because the launch failed. The following visual evidence shows infrared imagery of the parking lot. You can see the central locations of fires, some debris of rooftops, no craters can be identified. I want to show you that myself. This is the area of the hospital, okay? We are showing the parking lot and the hospital, okay? Those are in red spots. This is not in infrared, so you can understand it betterly. This is the parking lot. This is the parking lot. You can see the parking lot also now in this picture shown here, okay? Aftermath, after the hit. There is no structural damage to the building. The walls stayed intact. There are no craters here. All of the above, which I said, no structural damage. The walls stay intact, no craters. These are the characterized that shows that it's not an aerial munition that have hit the parking lot.
There we are. That is the IDF version of what happened, or part of their version of what happened. Joe Biden is here in Israel. His visit is underway. Sky News will have a special program on what's going on the Israel-Hamas war. That is live from here in Jerusalem, 9 o'clock, and my colleague Anna Botting will have that. More from here in a moment or two, but let's go back to Kay.
Mark, thank you. Another big story developing this morning, of course, was the latest inflation figures and the way they impact you. Who else but Ed is here to talk us through it.
Shall I just show you, actually, because
Yes,
it's quite useful sometimes to see, you know, what this actually means in terms of a chart. I mean, because this is, let me bring it up. This is showing you the inflation data over the past few years, and, you know, there's no mistaking where the cost of living crisis actually came. The higher this line is, that's the higher the prices are rising. That's the rate at which prices are rising each year. So it's an annual rate of inflation. It went up to those kind of double-digit levels. We're still very high, so it's now stayed kind of steady at 6.7%. But here's the thing, I mean, obviously, looking off into the future, the question is kind of whether it comes down again, and also, crucially, whether, as far as the Chancellor is concerned, and indeed the Prime Minister, whether they can hit that target of halving inflation by the end of the year. The interesting thing, actually, if you kind of look at the forecast that the Bank of England has produced, is that they think we're going to have quite a sharp fall over the course of the next few months. And that indeed would mean, look, you can see, look at the red dot and look at where that line is. You can see that the government would get inflation down faster than its target of halving it. But there's still really big questions about that. Economists have been, you know, incredibly wrong about this. They didn't forecast it was going to rise so high. They might be wrong about this as well. But even so, as you were saying, Kay, you know, there is still a lot of pressure on households because this number here, this rate at which prices are rising, is still well above where you would normally hope for it to be, which is kind of down around there at 2%. So still a long way to go. I don't think, you know, I don't think anyone's going to be panicking about these numbers. That's one thing to say. It's not like that's going to kind of change the big picture, which is that interest rates are kind of high at the moment, that the Bank of England has got them at 2.25%, but by the same token that they don't necessarily look like they're going to be raising them that much higher at the moment. That's what markets think, at least.
Sure. Andrew Griffith for the Treasury was in this morning. This is what he said.
Well, I'm not going to get in, and I hope you'll understand, I'm not going to get into conjecture either about the Prime Minister's movements. He's heavily engaged in the diplomatic efforts. He's spoken to most of the Middle East leaders, as well as remaining in close contact with the US President. I don't think we know that. I don't think we should get into speculation either about that.
What can he achieve by going?
But the UK has a strong record of working with countries around the world, of supporting both the protection of civilians in any conflict theatre, but also in maintaining international law and indeed the international rules-based order. We're on track. It's not going to be easy. We always said it wouldn't be easy. We've had to take responsible but tough choices. But what today's inflation figures show that we agree with most commentators out there that we're on track to halve inflation this year.
How concerned are you that the Bank of England may increase rates still further?
We're always concerned about the impact on ordinary people, Kay, and that's the big challenge of interest rates. So what's the bit the government can do? What we can do is be responsible with our public finances, not make promises about spending or indeed tax cuts that can't be financed and would put more pressure on inflation and more pressure on interest rates. Of course concerned, but we're doing everything that is within our control to try and minimise that on people.
So not only talking about what's happening with the Prime Minister going to Israel in the next couple of days, but also his view on what's going to happen with inflation.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, to some extent, you know, the two are not unrelated. Obviously, what's happening in the Middle East at the moment, you know, there's terrible humanitarian concerns, the lives of citizens at stake, and as we've seen, some tragedies on both sides. However, a lot of people within markets also watching what's happening there for a sense, obviously, of whether that will escalate and for a sense of what that means for the global economy. It's a very scary moment, both in terms of the geopolitics, but also in terms of the economic implications as well. And right now, actually, oil prices is probably the best metric of how that's going to play out, at least as far as markets are concerned. And so far, I was just in Marrakesh at the meeting of finance ministers at the IMF just over the weekend, and a lot of them were telling me that they were surprised that oil prices hadn't risen as fast as, you know, that they hadn't risen that much. They thought they were going to rise a bit higher based on their nervousness, suggesting that markets aren't quite as concerned as many other people about the escalation there. So far, at least, but it's early days.
I know you're going to update us throughout the rest of the day. For now, Ed, thanks very much indeed. A little bit earlier on today, we were telling you about a chap in Belgium who basically was responsible for many hundreds, if not thousands, of people being smuggled across the channel on those flimsy boats. He's been sentenced, and to that end, Adam is standing by for us. Hi, Adam, tell us more.
Hi, Kay. Yeah, in the courthouse here in Bruges, Hiwa Rahimpour has just been sentenced to 11 years in prison, along with a fine of €80,000. Now, there were 21 defendants on trial. 20 of them have been convicted. He has got the longest sentence. His de facto number 2 has been given 10 years. Rahimpour sought asylum in Britain, made a life in London, initially set up a barber shop, then a sweet counter out there in East London. But he was living a double life, using that shop as a front for taking payments and organising cross-channel crossings, effectively as one of the leaders of a international organised crime gang. Now, he was detained by the National Crime Agency as part of a pan-European investigation across Britain, Germany, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and all of the members of that organisation have been prosecuted here in Belgium. Rahimpour will serve his prison sentence here. This is one of the biggest people smuggling trials of modern times. Now, the National Crime Agency thinks that he and this gang could have been responsible for something like 10,000 people crossing the channel, charging them anywhere between £1,500 and £6,000 each to cross. Rahimpur is a complicated subject. He was fractious and angry in court. Just now felt that he hadn't been treated with respect. He's been on a hunger strike while in detention in Belgium. But he also has a complicated background. He said that he was from Iran when he came to Britain. We now know he's from Iraq. In fact, even his name, Hua Rahimpur, is a lie. We've been investigating him, and of course you can read and watch those investigations over the course of Sky News today. One thing, though, is very clear. Hua Rahimpur is in prison.
OK, Adam, for now, thanks. Big question. Should Rishi Sunak still travel to the Middle East, Israel specifically, if the IDF could be responsible for the barbarity of what happened at that hospital in Gaza? Mari will have more in just a sec. Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to The Breakfast Show here on Sky News. Mari's with me. We've been reflecting, of course, on what's been happening in the Middle East. Joe Biden, the President of the United States, has just arrived for talks. He was met on the ground by Benjamin Netanyahu. Could it be our Prime Minister tomorrow?
Well, I'm not going to get in, and I hope you'll understand, I'm not going to get into conjecture either about the Prime Minister's movements. He's heavily engaged in the diplomatic efforts. He's spoken to most of the Middle East leaders, as well as remaining in close contact with the US President. I don't think we know that. I don't think we should get into speculation either about that.
What can he achieve by going?
But the UK has a strong record of working with countries around the world, of supporting both the protection of civilians in any conflict theatre but also in maintaining international law and indeed the international rules-based order.
Thoughts, Mary? Good morning.
Good morning, Kay. Yes, so Andrew Griffith there, he is a Treasury Minister, but when you were asking him about that potential imminent visit from Rishi Sunak to Israel, he didn't want to get into any detail or speculation, but we know that Sky News understands that could come as early as Thursday. Now, the interesting thing is the Labour Party have been saying this morning that we need to wait for kind of third-party verified information before we can be sure who is responsible or what group is responsible for the terrible explosion at that hospital in Gaza. But also, I think until we have certainty about exactly who is responsible, questions will continue to swirl around whether the timing is the right time for the Prime Minister to be visiting Israel when we are not 100% sure exactly what has happened yet on the ground. And also, we've got PMQs today, Prime Minister's questions at midday, and I think MPs will be asking these kinds of questions themselves. They will want answers for their constituents as well.
That image we showed there of the Prime Minister, of course, was in North London earlier on in the week, offering support to Jews in that area. Mark, standing by.
Yeah, hi, Kay. Whether Rishi Sunak is coming or not, Joe Biden is certainly here this morning. He's arrived in Tel Aviv for talks with Benjamin Netanyahu, just as Israel is saying that it's not responsible for the explosion at a hospital in Gaza, which Hamas officials say killed 500 people. Let's speak now then to the Israeli government spokesman, Elon Levy. Good morning. Thank you for being with us. So just to be clear, are you, good morning. Are you saying, is your stance that Israel did not do this, 100% Israel did not do this?
Thank you. I think it's time to put this issue to rest. The mounting evidence, which is incontrovertible really by this point, is that what happened last night is that Palestinian Islamic Jihad launched a rocket from inside the Gaza Strip, that it misfired. It fell short inside the Gaza Strip and hit the parking lot of that hospital. Now, the evidence is there for everyone to see. This isn't a case of we're not 100% sure, he said, she said. The evidence from the IDF, declassified evidence, independent evidence, is there for everyone to see and examine the evidence. For one, Al Jazeera broadcast the whole thing live at 6:59. You can see on the Al Jazeera footage a rocket exploding from a volley and crashing, and then the fire at the hospital. There is also security cam footage from Netiva Asara, one of the villages destroyed by the Hamas death squads in the 7th of October massacre, again showing a volley of rockets, one falling short and an explosion. And the IDF has even declassified intelligence with a video recording, with a voice recording of a phone call between Hamas operatives saying this was Palestinian Islamic Jihad firing a rocket from a cemetery behind a hospital. So we can put this issue to rest. What happened yesterday was a war crime. It was a war crime by Islamic Jihad trying to commit an atrocity against Israeli civilians, but ended up killing Palestinian civilians. We don't know how many people were killed. Let's treat with a healthy dose of skepticism, everything coming from the Hamas
that's the point. I wonder, Elon. Yeah, and on that, Elon, I just wonder, because it's an interesting point. There were questions this morning about whether an Islamic Jihad rocket could have caused that much damage, or more specifically, that many deaths. Is Israel, are you disputing as well the number of deaths that are being claimed by Hamas?
First of all, absolutely, we're disputing everything that Hamas claims. Let's remember, we're 12 days since the October 12th massacre. Israel is still trying to identify and count the dead, and it was extremely suspect that Hamas, within minutes, immediately threw out outrageous numbers. There is simply no way that it could possibly have those numbers so soon. The Gaza Health Ministry is Hamas. Hamas is ISIS. It's the terror organization that perpetrated the October 7th massacre. That's not difficult. Absolutely, we dispute those numbers. We would expect the international media as well to independently verify things before reporting them. We know that Hamas has an interest in waging a war of misinformation against Israel in order to generate the very same international sympathy that we're seeing that then supports its claims to get Israel to lay off the airstrikes, and that we are taking in defensive action in order to destroy the terror organization that was behind that horrific October 7th massacre. Now, as for why it caused such a big explosion, first, let's get the evidence about how big the explosion was. But let's remember, one, if it was a rocket that misfired, it means its fuel wasn't used on the trajectory itself, and that fuel would have exploded in the explosion. And secondly, we know that Hamas often keeps ammunition underneath schools, underneath hospitals, and that, I assume, is one scenario that the army and the media should also be investigating, whether it hit a secondary depot. But certainly a rocket that misfired and all that fuel from a long-range rocket falling short inside the Gaza Strip would definitely explain the fireball that we saw in that footage.
Yeah. Just to be clear on the point about Hamas claims, I was on air actually last night, and we did say that these were claims by Hamas, that we couldn't independently confirm them at that time because, well, for one thing, we don't have our own journalists in Gaza, but also that we were awaiting the Israeli version on this. So we do qualify these things. Now, I just think an important thing more broadly is that the Israelis constantly say that they are not targeting civilians, but it is claimed, and I say claimed, that 3,000 have been killed in the last 10 days. So I just wonder why people should believe you when you say you're not targeting, when you get numbers like that, so many numbers, and the images from the hospitals that we're seeing. Just a broader point, that one.
You're right. The images we're seeing coming from inside the Gaza Strip are very unpleasant to watch. And that is the reality of war. It's the reality of a war in which a terror organization in the vein of ISIS has embedded itself so deeply within populated civilian areas, within schools, within hospitals, underneath people's homes. That is Hamas's modus operandi, to embed itself and use its civilians as human shields. And that is exactly why Israel is urging the residents of northern Gaza to vacate south temporarily for their own safety. In doing that, we're fully complying with our obligations under international humanitarian law to give a warning wherever possible. I think we've already forfeited the element of surprise in order to allow as many civilians as possible to get out of harm's way. We don't want to see any more civilians being hurt. We don't want to see any more casualties. That's why we're asking them to evacuate for their own safety.
Just one last point. If you were not bombing Gaza, then people, I suppose, would not be taking sanctuary in the car park of a hospital.
That is a very fair point. And if Hamas had not invaded on the morning of the 7th of October, if it hadn't butchered 1,400 people, maimed 4,000, taken 200 hostages into Israel in the worst terror attack in world history since 9/11, we would not be in this war. This isn't a war that we wanted. It's not a war that we started. It's not a war that we expected. It is a war that Hamas has dragged us into with the war crime of the October 7th massacre. And it is a war that we are determined to win, because we have no choice and we can no longer exist with this ISIS-style terror organization on our borders. We're going to win, and we're going to win decisively.
OK, Elon Levy, appreciate your time this morning. And it is a morning when Joe Biden arrived here in Israel. He is holding talks now in Tel Aviv with Israeli leaders. We'll have more on that throughout the morning. Let's go back now, though, to Kay in London.
Mark, thanks. Much emotion on both sides of the divide here in the United Kingdom, coming down to whether or not even there should be blue and white lights on the arch at Wembley. Is it important? Why is it important if it is? All of that to come in just a moment. what we're going to do. We're going to talk about what's happening with the Wembley Arch, and we're going to talk about politics and how it overlaps with sport. To that end, Yasin Patel, you may recognise he was with us a little bit earlier on in the week. Sports discrimination barrister, also human rights barrister, I think it's fair to say that as well. And Paddy Buckley, sports writer for...
just generally.
Generally
at
now,
the moment, yeah.
I was going to say the Standard.
That was the last one, yeah.
What do you think? Wembley Arch, blue and white, yes or no?
I think the FA took the right decision, perhaps for the wrong reasons. I can completely understand why Jews and others were absolutely outraged by the initial refusal because of the statement that was issued with it, which could have been interpreted, in fact, really could only have been interpreted as some kind of equivalence between signalling of the kind that lighting up an arch represents.
What do you think?
I think the FA always get criticised for various things. On this occasion, they've acted with dignity and very fair. They made sure the players went out with armbands. They sent a very strong message out. Delly Davis, who's the chair of the Inclusionary Advisory Board, said that we want there to be peace, we don't want war, we want the suffering to stop for both Israelis and Palestinians. And in light of that, to just have the Israeli flag on the arch, the FA would have been in for a lot of criticism. You've got to look at the game in this country. There is investment from all over the world. Our leagues have players from all over the world. We're an international game, it's a game for all. And so the game has a duty to ensure that it's fair to every single person. So I think the FA acted correctly on this occasion.
Rabbi Alex Goldberg, chair of the faith group for the FA, was incensed and resigned.
Well, I'm kind of not surprised because, I agree that, you're talking about the Arab investment in the international game of football in Paris as well as in England. But this we were talking about late last week, where we're talking now in different circumstances, but at that time we were talking about a simple atrocity, a simply revolting atrocity by one side against the other. It wasn't a complicated situation at all. So I felt, and I agree about there needs to be much more careful thought about blatant signalling. But I still thought the statement that the FA, I just respectfully disagree with you that statement was appropriate because there is no equivalent between a murderer and his victim.
In relation to the rabbi, firstly, I respect him fully for what he said, but one's got to remember, and the FA highlighted this, that the group that's represented by them is an advisory group, but not part of the FA. In terms of the arch being lit on this occasion, back in 2019, we had the atrocity in New Zealand. It wasn't lit then. It has been lit on various other occasions. How does the FA differentiate as a not-for-profit organisation, not a spokesman for the government, but as an organisation that is there for everyone? How does it differentiate between what it's asked to say is right or wrong in a conflict that hasn't started on the 7th of October, but it's been there for 100 years? Mm-hmm. If they decide that, well, this act is worthy of showing that flag, then what's to come afterwards? And we mustn't forget that the team we were playing was Australia.
I just want to listen to Benjamin Netanyahu.
Found out their hiding places. Hamas kidnapped women, children, elderly, Holocaust survivors. I know you share our outrage on this, and I know you share our determination to bring these people back. On October 7th, Hamas murdered 1,400 Israelis, maybe more. This is in a country of fewer than 10 million people. This would be equivalent to over 50,000 Americans murdered in a single day. That's 29 9/11s. That is why October 7th is another day that will live in infamy. Mr. President, you rightly said that Hamas is worse than ISIS. The German chancellor who visited here yesterday said that Hamas were the new Nazis. You're both right. And just as the civilized world united to defeat the Nazis and united to defeat ISIS, the civilized world must unite to defeat Hamas. I can assure you, Mr. President, Israel is united to defeat Hamas, and we will defeat Hamas and remove this terrible threat from our lives. The forces of civilization will prevail for our sake, for your sake, for peace and security in our region and in the world. Mr. President, for the people of Israel, there's only one thing better than having a true friend like you standing with Israel, and that is having you standing in Israel. Your visit here is the first visit of an American president in Israel at a time of war. It is deeply, deeply moving. It speaks to the depth of your personal commitment to Israel. It speaks to the depth of your personal commitment to the future of the Jewish people and the one and only Jewish state. So I know I speak for all the people of Israel when I say, thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for standing with Israel today, tomorrow, and always.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you very much. Look, folks, I wanted to be here today for a simple reason. I want the people of Israel, the people of the world, to know where the United States stands. I've got my great Secretary of State here. He's been here for a lot, but I wanted to personally come and make that clear. Terrorist group Hamas has slaughtered, as has been pointed out, over 1,300 people. And it is not hyperbole to suggest slaughtered. And including 31 Americans. And they've taken scores of people hostage, including children. You said, imagine what those children hiding from Hamas were thinking. It's beyond my comprehension to be able to imagine what they're thinking. Beyond my comprehension. They're committed evils that, atrocities that make ISIS look somewhat more rational. You know, Americans are agreeing with you. They really are. And Americans are worried. Americans are worried because we know this is not an easy field to navigate, what you have to do. But the fact is that Israel, as they respond to these attacks, seems to me that have to continue to ensure that you have what you need to defend yourselves. And we're going to make sure that occurs, as you know. And we have to also bear in mind that Hamas does not represent all the Palestinian people, and has brought them only suffering. You know, years ago, I asked the Secretary of State when he and I were working in the Senate to write something for a man. Said, he wrote a line that I think is appropriate. He said, it's not, we need not just, well, I won't go into it, I'll wait later, taking too much time, but the point is this, that I was deeply saddened and outraged by the explosion at the hospital in Gaza yesterday. And based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you. But there's a lot of people out there who are not sure. So we've got to overcome a lot of things. And also he's encouraging life-saving capacity to help the Palestinians who are innocent, caught in the middle of this. And well, at any rate, that's who we are. Not just me, but that's who the United States is. And it's just not the example of our power, it's the power of our example that's almost as important. The world's looking. Israel has a value set like the United States does, and other democracies, and they're looking to see what we're going to do. So, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm very happy to be back in Israel with you. Thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to having a thorough discussion about where everybody goes from here. But thank you, and I want to say to the people of Israel, their courage, their commitment, their bravery is stunning. It's really stunning. I'm proud to be here.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys. Thank you, press. Thanks, guys. We're it out. Thanks, guys. We're moving. We're walking out. Press is walking out. Press is walking out.
OK. Well, there we are. That seems to be the end of that, with shouted questions in Joe Biden's ear. But he made some interesting points. He said that after the awful massacre in southern Israel, that America would stand behind Israel. He said Israel know they can respond to that attack, and they need to have what they need or want to defend themselves. He made that point very clearly. But he also said to Benjamin Netanyahu there that Hamas does not represent all the Palestinian people. And he said you have to help the Palestinians who are innocent and caught up in all this. Now, joining me now is Amy. Sorry, I thought I was going to speak to Alistair Bunkle then, but apparently he's not there at the moment. So let's just pop back to Kay.
OK, for now, thanks very much indeed, Mark. Thank you, Mark, illustrating the challenges ahead, not only for Benjamin Netanyahu today, but also the President of the United States, who has arrived on Air Force One within the last hour or so. Some suggestions that he may travel on to Egypt after that, although that has not been confirmed. Briefings that had been planned with other Arab leaders have been cancelled as a result of what happened with the hospital strike in Gaza overnight. Amy Shallan, chair of the British Palestinian Committee, is with us. Hi, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us. We chatted earlier on in the week. Who do you think is responsible for what happened last night?
This isn't a question of two different narratives. I think what we need to really reflect on here is the fact that 25 hospitals have been ordered to evacuate by Israel. Al-Ahli hospital has already been struck a couple of days ago by a smaller missile. And there has been very clear warnings that have been given to hospitals that they are going to come under attack. And in addition to that, we've had language coming from Israel which has been very clear that it considers Palestinians in Gaza to be human animals and that they will act accordingly. And they have also said that Gaza will never be the same and that they intend to eliminate everything. So I think that's the context in which we have to look at the attack on Al-Ahli hospital.
When you say they, who do you mean?
The Israeli government spokespeople. We've had countless people. That was talking about eliminating Gaza. That was the Minister of Defence.
Eliminating Hamas.
Sorry?
Eliminating Hamas.
No, they said we will eliminate Gaza. They said Gaza, his exact quote was, Gaza will never be the same. We will eliminate everything.
I'll take your word for that. I haven't seen that specific quote. Talk to me, though, about why you think that it's not important who actually carried out who was responsible for the attack. So who is responsible?
So I think this is clearly a war crime. I think everything points towards it being Israel who has conducted this attack. We have seen misinformation before. I think it's very important that what is called for now is an immediate ceasefire to stop any further atrocities unfolding. We have human rights organisations being exceptionally concerned that what we are seeing is a genocidal attack on Gaza. And we know that misinformation has come from Israel with previous attacks. We saw in the case of Shireen Abu Akleh that there were out-and-out denials that it was an Israeli soldier that had shot and killed her. Then it was that she was caught in the ceasefire. And finally, there was an admission that it had indeed been an Israeli sniper who had shot and killed her, but that no action would be taken. So I think we need to look at it in that context and ensure that regardless of who carried out that attack on Al Ahli Hospital, a ceasefire has to be called for now, and any war crimes have to stop.
Likelihood of that happening, in your opinion?
Well, it all depends on the international community, and essentially the unconditional support for Israel has led us to where we are now, today. And that's the US government, as we've just heard, US President Biden giving unconditional support, but also the UK government, who have been put on notice that they are essentially supporting what could amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza, and that they could be criminally liable. So we've seen both the government, the UK government, and the opposition coming out in full support of Israel's, as they say, right to defence.
Within international law is what they
Well,
say.
they said that, but
exactly
they also supported in the same breath, we heard Keir Starmer support the complete siege on Gaza, which is against international law. And essentially, if there are weapons and military support going to Gaza now, but also diplomatic support, because international states have a duty to protect people from potential acts of genocide. And we are now hearing very clear claims that what we are seeing is essentially an impending genocidal assault on Gaza, and international states have a clear duty to prevent that.
I'm afraid we are out of time, Amy. That's the end of the show, but I would like to be able to talk to you again perhaps next week. We can talk further on what's happened and the appeal for a ceasefire, where that takes us over the next few days. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to join us. Joe Biden has arrived in Tel Aviv. He is likely to be there for several hours, had hoped to speak to several Arab leaders in the region. That is now not happening, but he is spending time with Benjamin Netanyahu. We'll have more on that throughout the course of the day here on Sky News. So we'll have more on that in just a few moments' time here on Sky News with Will.